Well, first of all, I think intuition I don't think it's necessarily well understood, but it's an incredibly powerful part of human psychology, part of the mind. Because I think in intuition, you're taking all kinds of variables and sort of munging them together with certain experiences that you have that kind of validate or invalidate maybe other types of stimulus that are coming in. And you're kind of saying, I think this. And you don't necessarily even have all the facts. That's intuition, or that's gut. I think that, look, when it comes to leading, there are such things as natural leaders. But I think to be a really effective leader in the long haul, I think you need to intellectualize some of that. You need to know what parts of your gut are right and why, and then begin to build a framework of reasoning for that. So that becomes sort of the foundation for what does good leadership look like.
Welcome to Warriors at Work. This is Jeannie Coomber, your guide and host. Warriors at Work is a place where everyone in the workplace can come together, gain insight, encouragement, tell stories, connect, and share wisdom. We are a place of like-minded people at different stages of life, all coming together with a shared interest of enlightening and inspiring one another. If you're interested in going from the predictable to the potent, and you want to find your warrior magic, step into the journey with us. Welcome to Warriors at Work. Hi everybody, it's Jeannie. Thank you so much for joining me here at the Warriors at Work podcast. I have had the absolute pleasure of interviewing Dave Falter. And the conversation that you're about to hear is all about leadership philosophy. And not in the traditional C-suite CEO approach, but really tangibly how to lead with and through people, how to create an environment of servant leadership. My next guest truly embodies so many of the warrior attributes that we have talked about since the beginning of the Warriors at Work experience. Everything from optimism to possibility thinking to courage. Dave is a 6-time CEO and board director who has successfully led companies ranging from 25 million to more than $1 billion across numerous industries. He talks about his personal mission to inspire dedication, hard work, and loyalty among everyone that he works with. His expertise runs the gamut. You're going to hear a lot of his CEO perspective, but also his business savvy through this conversation. But more than anything, you're going to feel his heart, his care for employees, his care for mission, purpose, and value. And I felt so privileged to be able to have this conversation with him and provide this perspective to all of you here at the Warriors at Work community. Enjoy. Thank you, everybody, for joining me on this fabulous episode of the Warriors at Work podcast. I am thrilled to have with me a very interesting and multifaceted leader, Dave Falter. So, Dave, thank you so much for being in this conversation with me today.
It's my great pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So here, Dave, you're such a fascinating guy. I did a lot of research about you before we came into this conversation, and you and I had the opportunity to talk and get to know each other. And there's a couple of things that struck me about you and your background. You're referred to as a CEO, a board director, an author, a blogger, a consultant, and a leadership development thought leader. How do you describe you?
Interestingly enough, probably the one word that's not in there is coach. And I think that is the thing that I find most interesting. That is the thing that energizes me. I think that's probably that modality or sort of that projection on myself is the thing that I think it creates my most effective leadership moments with others. I think coaching tends to be a kind of an interesting amalgam of things that you know, things that you believe, and then sort of how you use those things as a crucible to help others, find their best selves.
I love that word, crucible.
Yeah, it can be kind of hot sometimes.
Yeah. So is there a particular example that's coming to mind where you were like, I really brought out the best in somebody else? You really use this word effective leadership. Did you have a crucible moment that comes to mind that really amplifies that point?
Well, I've had many. I mean, I'm pleased to say I've had many. Part of what I've done, both as an executive leader in my own sort of resume, as it were, my own career, but also as a consultant for a number of years, where a big part of what I did was executive coaching. Is I had many crucible moments. Some of them were about helping very promising executives sort of see why they were promising. They kind of believed it, but they didn't really understand how it was manifesting, how they could manifest it, for that matter, or how it was manifesting itself into their career, into their peer group, obviously into their larger organization. In some cases, it was executives who were modeling the wrong behaviors, frankly. Because they had either come up through, either because of challenges they had as children in terms of how their parents taught them how to act, behave, think, or where executives had, unfortunately, the bad fortune of executives or executive leaders, a couple cases, and people who had military executive leaders, where they weren't taking the best of those leaders' practices or principles, and they were kind of modeling the bad stuff, and were not breaking through. They were not being identified as rising leaders in their own organizations, or in a couple cases where they had left kind of corporate America and had gone to start their own businesses, were really struggling with growing their businesses, and they were the problem. They were the problem. So those were all crucible moments that were, for me, incredibly important, I think, in terms of feeling like I was effective. But most important is that they became effective. They became much more effective and began to realize some of their goals, whether that was for the business itself or their own personal career journey.
So let's talk more about you and your particular experience in the world, because you shared with me when we were preparing for this conversation that you are an executive who has not had a career. So say more about that.
Well, I did share that with you. I think it was a private moment. No, I'm just joking.
We're out in the open now.
I think, my career is more like a quilt. It does have thematic underpinnings. Like, I've always pretty much been a technology executive. I've had a couple small deviations, but for the most part, I've always been in the technology industry in one way or another. But the way in which I found the jobs that I took, I'm not the guy with the 30 years or 40 years who's going to get the gold watch. I've had a lot of different jobs, and that was not always understandable by prospective employers, by the executive recruitment community, et cetera, based on my vintage. And I'm a very young boomer, but I'm in the boomer vintage, where people stayed in jobs for, a decade at a time. I mean, the longest job I've held was 8 years, and that was a business I owned myself. So I think that my career has been largely driven by inquiry and interest and problem solving. So my wife and I joke a little bit that I've never met a problem I didn't like. And she says that's actually one of the reasons why you sometimes make interesting choices about what you're going to do. But I've always been very interested in running business or leading businesses. And, frankly, those businesses or their owners or their boards of directors have found me and sort of said, we understand that you like to solve problems, and we've got some hairy ones here that we'd like to take a look at. And inevitably, I see things that I think I know how to fix. And there's always going to be things that are going to be broken that no one either knows or they're not telling you. And then you have to decide, do I know how to fix that too? But it's not all about you anyway. You're going to be gathering a group of exceptional executives who will help you solve those problems together. So I think it's a little bit like Frost in a way, with the road, the road not taken. I took the path I took the one less traveled by, and that's made all the difference, I think, is the quote. And Frost wasn't in that poem judging. He was just simply saying, I took a different path, and it's led me to where I am. So I did have a father who was a government executive, ended up being a very successful civilian in the Air Force. But he was like, that 30-year guy. And as soon as he kind of got his 30 years, man, he punched out. And he was a super smart guy and a very keen problem solver. But he kind of kept it really narrow banded, as it were. And I've always found that the kinds of problems that I like to solve for, exist all over business. And so they've taken me. So anyway, long answer to a short question, but my career is sort of this winding path, this sort of quilt of lots of different things.
Yeah, the word that I was thinking of is like portfolio. the headline is I like to solve problems, and within is like all these different divisional lines of experiences in a portfolio, and you slide in and out of the portfolio. So that's kind of what I was seeing. It's like, oh, it's a leader who has a portfolio mentality, is through each experience, oh, there's something else I'm going to add to my portfolio, but it's all driven by your affinity for solving problems. I mean, that's amazing, because I'm also thinking about, you are not in a position where you are flustered by that problem. You're actually inviting the problem in, which is kind of interesting. Usually it means more that you don't shy away from difficult conversations. You are not having any difficulty with experiencing something that's uncomfortable. It's like you really lean in. Is that an accurate depiction of how you're wired?
Well, first of all, that's very generous, but yes, I think that's accurate. I mean, if the portfolio analogy or metaphor is, I think, accurate. I think the major theme is growth. I'm fascinated by why things do grow. I'm fascinated by why things don't grow. Back in the days, many of our listeners probably don't even remember this. Maybe we weren't even in the workforce back in the .com boom and prior. There was all kinds of growth that was occurring, but it was kind of a natural growth, and I was fascinated by that too, where lots of money was coming in to finance ideas that were often not good, and the businesses kind of grew, but I used to call them sort of radioactive cucumbers. Like they grew, but they didn't really exist in reality, and they couldn't sustain themselves, et cetera. So, I think, I was a portfolio executive, very fair way to characterize me, who's really interested in the problems or challenges around growth. Sometimes you have to fix the business to grow, right? Sometimes the business has all kinds of characteristic elements of why it can be a grower, but it's not growing. And then you sort of figure out why. And then sometimes, of course, it's growing like a weed. And, growth kills more businesses than lack of business, largely because that has a direct connection to cash and cash flow. And most executives are not experienced at cash flow management, or they've been good at their functional role, and someone else's, like a CFO or treasury function or what have you, has had the responsibility of managing cash. And things are going gangbusters, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, we actually ran out of gas, and we've just reached 30,000 feet. Did anybody remember how to fill the tanks at 30,000 feet? So that's a fascinating challenge as well. So I've worked with hyper growth companies that are very young and very new. I've worked with large mature companies that still have growth opportunities, but they have to kind of reimagine certain dimensions of their business and their marketplace access. And I worked with a whole host of businesses that have good bones, but they just really don't know how to get there. So I find that all that to be very, very interesting. And as I said earlier, it's not all about me. I mean, it's like, I'm not going to solve these problems alone, but I get interested in the problem, and I drag people in, like, oh my God, he's got another problem. But, drag them in to solve the problem with me.
Yeah, because I'm going to break down some of your philosophies around leadership and management, because I think it's really fascinating and apropos to this conversation. One of the things that you started to touch on is your dad. So what I want to do is take a step back, and let's look at how you became who you are. Like, who were those key influencers and mentors in your life that you think are critical to how you show up and how you perceive the world right now?
Fair question for an interview like this. So I would say my father was not a strong influence on me as a businessman. My father and mother both. My father's deceased, so I'll speak with due respect. Was a very good executive in the Air Force, and sort of, learned how to navigate that space and made some pretty significant contributions. But he was not a businessman, so he's not a profit-oriented person. He was more like duty, mission, et cetera, which is kind of what you would expect. So I did not grow up at the dinner table with business people like myself, and my sons have grown up with a businessman and a mom who was actually a pretty astute businesswoman, at the table. So they are all very naturally kind of conversant with sort of the major concepts of business. I actually started my career thinking I was an aspiring academic. So I went to college, and I went to graduate school, learned that maybe the most politicized thing in the world is education and pedagogy. And I was like, I just don't know if I can handle this stuff, because I want to be a PhD and I want to be a doctorate in English. And so I did do that work, but I realized also that I wasn't really sure about the long-term economic opportunity in being in professional academia. So anyway, I left that space and kind of wandered into computing almost by accident and really liked business, really liked making money. And, you know, kind of I had the good fortune of working for some really nice logos in the late 80s and early 90s in the technology industry. And then I got this idea I wanted to start my own business, which, because I was going to Kellogg at night. I went to Kellogg at night because I realized that, no, I did not understand what anybody else was talking about as a liberal arts major. No, I mean, I knew how to write. I could analyze, I could synthesize, I could do all that stuff. Very proud of that, by the way. But I really didn't understand the context of business, sort of,
Okay.
what are we trying to accomplish here, sort of thing. So I was going to Kellogg at night, had the good fortune of being able to be a part of their evening program, which is, back in those days was, you know, I think you could graduate if you could stay awake, because most people were having babies, they had hotshot careers, they were getting married, you know. So anyway, I started this business with a 2-page business plan. So that's how well thought it out what it was. But I started a business, and it actually started to grow. And I hired a couple of people who were dumb enough to join me. Our personality, I think, at that point in time. And one of them was an older gentleman who was definitely in his sunset years in terms of his career, but I think he was still, you know, kicking around, looking for something to do. He had been a computing guy back in the mainframe days, and so, you know, he knew what he kind of knew his way around computing. And really nice guy named Jack, and he one day kind of asked me if he could meet in my office, and I said sure, and kind of came in and said, you know, hey Dave, I want to let you know something. Like, I think you're a really, really gifted guy. Like, I think you're a smart guy, and I think you could really go somewhere in business, but you have no idea what you're doing. And I was like, you know, I wasn't mad, because I was like, oh shit, he's got me.
Right,
You know?
yeah.
So he said, listen, I have 2 colleagues, guys that I used to work for, who started their own consultancy. And I think that they would be a real help to you. And I'll say their names. One fellow is still alive. He's elderly, and the other one's passed away regrettably, but they were Dick Benkendorf and Ed Grant. And Ed Grant had been, in addition to being a very, very senior executive at Amdahl Corporation, he had also been the CEO of LaSalle Bank here in Chicago. So he was like a player, and he was kind of in retirement, had decided to kind of consult and work with early stage high growth companies to try to help them sort of realize their potential. You know, take a small fee, maybe get some equity in the business, and hopefully something would work out. The other guy, Dick Benkendorf, had been very, very senior executive at IBM, had been the president of ADP. I mean, like, these guys were hitters. And I met him, and we all just kind of liked each other right away. Those guys literally taught me, and I was going to Kellogg and getting a formal business degree. Those guys taught me virtually everything I know about business, and they taught me it probably about a year's time, but they stayed with me throughout the life of my company, which I started in 92. I sold in late 99. They taught me about how to be a CEO. They taught me about how to be a manager. They taught me their own views about leadership, which I used, you know, in part to form my own views about leadership. They taught me how to be a board director, how to prepare board materials. Gosh, I mean, they helped me with supplier negotiations. They just really made me, oh my gosh, a materially better executive than I was. You know, I was running, you know, basically what, fake it till you make it. I was kind of running on natural ability, which was clearly going to exhaust itself quickly. And so anyway, those are the major influences. I've had lots of other bosses, you know, because I've been principally a CEO in most of my career. A lot of my bosses have been directors. But, you know, you always have a boss in shareholders.
Yeah.
Right? And you always have a boss in employees.
So let's talk about Musher Management. Dave has this fantastic blog called Musher Management. I would love for you to share the story about why you started a leadership blog called Musher Management.
So this would be like 2010, 2011. I was trying to figure, I had exited a private equity company, and I was trying to figure out what I was going to do next. I mean, in many cases, that for a lot of private equity executives, that's just a serial function. You kind of just wash, rinse, and repeat. It's either the same business that you're that you sold and now you're running again, or you get hired by another PE firm to run another thing. But I had taken a step away and tried to figure out what I wanted to do. And pardon me, and I kind of had this idea that I wanted to write a book about leadership and my leadership philosophy, which I call Musher Management, and I'll explain why. But it was, at the time, blogging was somewhat new. I mean, it wasn't brand new, but it was somewhat new. And I felt like there weren't enough leadership conversations happening kind of out there in the ether, as it were. And I thought maybe a good way for me to begin to develop the content for a book was to begin to blog on observations that I was making about other executives that I was working with, other executives that I was observing, much later with the ordination of Pope Francis. I even wrote about him as a musher, what I thought he was a musher. And we can talk about what I think a musher is. But so it started out kind of as a blog on its way, to create content to become a book. And I've also found out that writing a book is really hard. So so it ended up just becoming a bigger and bigger blog. And what ended up happening, one of the reasons why, I think I blogged for about 4 years. So people can go and see it. It's www.mushermanagement.com, all one word. But if those that come and visit it will find that it kind of stops in the 2014, 2015 era. And one of the reasons why I stopped is that I came to the realization that increasingly I was talking about difficult situations that my customers, because I was a consultant and I was a management consultant, I did a lot of coaching as a corollary of that, were the topic of my observation. And that, I was building a viewer base, a reader base rather, and I didn't want my customers to see themselves in print. And I wasn't saying anything unkind about them. But on the other hand, the blog was probably about a challenge that they were experiencing that I was, analyzing or addressing. And I thought, this is going to become a liability. So I stopped. But shall I tell you a little bit about Musher Management itself?
Yeah. Yes. Why Musher?
So why Musher? So Musher is kind of an amalgam of different things. Musher is there's part of it is some observations that I had made or stored in my mind in working for a CEO who at one time actually had been a peer, who really kind of didn't get it and had a very different sense of what leadership was. His idea of leadership was like, if we crash in the jungle, I got the machete, you follow me, I hack my way through the jungle. If you don't follow me, you're dead. And, which was sort of in many ways based on his own behaviors, was sort of amplified by a certain amount of narcissism. And I just didn't think that was right, okay? It had nothing to do with the fact that he and I were peers and he became my boss, anything like that. I had always felt that he'd had these challenges. That, on top of the fact that for a number of years I had in my own mind sort of this leadership philosophy concept that was brewing, that started with when I had started reading about servant leadership, and I started saying, that is me, I am that kind of executive. And I'll tell you a quick story about how I figured that out. And then actually experiencing dog sledding and spending time talking to people who actually provided the sledding experience, but more important, took care of the dogs, and really understanding the musher, really broke down the whole exercise or the whole thing of mushing, dog sledding. The servant leadership came from my entrepreneurial days. So I had I learned a lot. I had Ed and Dick, and I had a lot of learnings. But my business actually grew pretty substantially. And I'm happy to say it created enormous challenges and a lot of sleepless nights, but it also really grew. And I realized as I got from like employees 3, 4, 5 to employee 165, 167, 168 kind of thing, that I was losing control of them, as it were. I was losing. We didn't necessarily 168. Even if that person was coming in as an EVP, let's say, and they usually weren't, obviously, I didn't have the same relationship with them as I had with employees 2 or 3 or 4. Mm-hmm. And I realized that I had built this thing upon which I was entirely reliant. In the early days, they were reliant on me. Is Dave going to make the right choices? Am I going to get a paycheck? Like, we're going to have a business tomorrow. But once the business actually began to kind of pick up steam and become a true enterprise, I just kind of came to the realization that everybody was going at home at night and making a decision the next day to come back and work for the business, and by proxy to come back and work for me. But it wasn't about me anymore. That I was now beholden to them, and I was like, oh my God, I gotta find a new way to think about how I'm leading and running this thing. And so that began the journey. And I just happened to stumble across servant leadership, and I said, this makes a lot of sense to me. So where it all came together in kind of a intellectual cataclysm, as it were, where the light went on, was when I went on this dog sledding experience. So if people go to the website and they hear about the parable of the musher, I am actually not that executive. I'm happy to say, but I observed that executive in another context. I inserted him into the story. And what I did learn was, this is the fundamental principle of Musher Management, is it's really about self-interested caretaking. Self-interested caretaking. So the idea is you are building an environment, we call it culture now, but you're building an environment where your activity, your commitment to the best interest of your people will raise you up as the individual leader. And what you see in dog sledding is that the dogs cannot survive without the musher, and the musher cannot survive without the dogs. You cannot win the Iditarod pulling the sled without dogs, for instance, across the line. It would be literally a 0% chance that would happen, because you would have died well before then, right? Nor can the dogs pull the sled across the line without the musher on the back. So everybody's got to do this together. You've got to be in it together. So the principles of self-interested caretaking are, how do you translate the things that naturally kind of ended up falling into the bucket when you're the CEO, the natural instincts around me, I, and turn it into, yeah, it is about me, but at the end of the day, it's about them, because that's how it makes it about me. Everybody wins. Everybody wins in that modality. And then the other thing I would say that comes out of Musher Management, and there's all kinds of things. If you read the blog, which I'd be completely flattered if anybody even read it anymore, but there are ideas about the dogs. Like, you have to be able to articulate to people what their job is, how they function. They need to understand their relationship to one another. One of the things about the dogs is that the mushers, or I should say the dog handlers, who in many cases are actually the mushers, they understand their dogs very well. They know what dogs should probably be in the front. They know what dogs want to be close to the sled. They know what dogs are kind of be in the middle, they're kind of the pullers, as it were. But they also know that they also leash these dogs up so that they understand their relationship to one another. It's actually fascinating. And I also thought, well, that was an interesting extrapolation of principle that's really important, is that I think a lot of leaders don't understand where leadership kind of begins in management. Leadership really starts. And a big part of management is articulation and clarity, and people understanding roles, responsibilities, spans of control, interrelatedness, etc. So my belief is, to be a good leader, you must be a good follower. If you do not understand what a follower needs, how can you be an effective leader? All right. So I believe that most great leaders, you will find, even when they're in high test, AA, AAA plus environments, can demonstrate dynamically, like on the moment, abilities to follow others, because they understand what their role is. They understand, oh, I need to be here now.
Let's talk about 2020 and the workplace right now. Who are those mushers that you're following?
Well, Nadella, I mean, the CEO of Microsoft is clearly a musher, and I've talked to people. I do not know him. I wish I did, but I don't. I've talked to people who do know him or do work for him, and based on what they've told me about his leadership practices and what have you, he's absolutely a musher. And I think, look what he's done. Look what he's done with that company. I mean, I love Bill Gates. I admire the heck out of him, right? Steve Ballmer, but I love Gates, right? And both of those guys built this massive franchise, right? But it's nothing compared to what it is now. And that distance that they've traveled as a company, particularly in terms of market cap, has all been under the new CEO, who's not that new anymore.
There's the growth executive right there.
Yeah,
playing in the growth. Yep.
Right. Well, he exactly, because I think the other guys, again, very talented, brilliant men, but they weren't good listeners in some ways. They had their ideas about what the franchise was all about. And most people will tell you, in terms of inside baseball about Bill, it was very hard to knock him off of those ideas. Ballmer had very similar points of view about the business. And Nadella was like, I see all these other opportunities that I think we should be capturing or liberating the franchise, really. And, it was, he knew how to get his people to follow him. And they've unleashed like hundreds of billions of dollars of market cap under his leadership. So I think he's one for sure. I'll be honest with you. I've seen more examples of not Musher in 2020. I'll put a little plug in for our healthcare workers and our essential workers. I see a lot of leadership at that level, a lot of leadership, and people are making, business for the most part is not about life or death decisions, and yet these are life or death decisions every single day, and they are figuring out how to prioritize the needs of the individual with the needs of the family that surround that individual who's ill, with the needs of the enterprise, the hospital, the system, whatever. I mean, I'm fascinated at how well these people are performing under this incredible duress.
When you think about the seat you sit in and the amount of businesses that you've had relationship to, what do you think the workplace needs more of right now?
Again, I think the culture of caretaking has become not just a fad, but has become an important dimension of measuring executive leaders. So I think that's been good, and more of that is good. I think I'm seeing, the pandemic has accelerated self-service systems, do-it-yourself kinds of modalities, so that smart people can get things done in a smart way without having to work through a lot of bureaucracy. I'm seeing certain elements of what in the technology industry you might call agile cultures or agile performance models becoming more increasingly part of mainstream ways of getting work done. But what I will tell you is, in my opinion, I think this idea that we've all been socialized to remote working via video conferencing, and that is good enough. I think that is wrong. I think that is a dangerous and slippery slope, because I think human beings don't have relationships with screens. You and I can only have so much of a relationship through this environment. And I think that personal interaction, in terms of being in the office, and I'm not saying people have to be in the office all the time. I think we'll probably end up going back to some kind of a hybrid model, but being in office and being in proximity, I think, creates opportunities for young executives to model more senior executives. It gives, particularly for the millennials, and actually I can't speak for sort of the middle generation, but especially for the boomers, the sense of community and camaraderie that comes with being in a physical place is super, super important, I think, to, interestingly enough, sort of the old guard and the young guard. And so I think that we've got to figure out, we cannot believe that remote work, or certainly that video conferencing, it should be the new normal.
One thing that I was also thinking about, we didn't touch on this, but I think it's very interesting, especially as I relate to this whole brand of the Warriors at Work. I believe philosophically that we're so much more than our professional attributes. How does intuition and gut play into leadership from your standpoint?
Intuition, I think, well, first of all, I think intuition I don't think it's necessarily well understood, but it's an incredibly powerful part of human psychology, part of the mind. Because I think in intuition, you're taking all kinds of variables and sort of munging them together with certain experiences that you have that kind of validate or invalidate maybe other types of stimulus that are coming in. And you're kind of saying, I think this. And you don't necessarily even have all the facts. That's intuition, or that's gut. I think that, look, when it comes to leading, there are such things as natural leaders. But I think to be a really effective leader in the long haul, I think you need to intellectualize some of that. You need to know what parts of your gut are right and why, and then begin to build a framework of reasoning for that. So that becomes sort of the foundation for what does good leadership look like, as opposed to leading by gut. You're always in the moment. The bad example of that is, for instance, the cultures of personality. Leaders who don't really intellectualize their leadership ability end up being leaders by cult of personality, almost inevitably. And cultures of personality are not scalable. I think that they're inherently dangerous. They certainly are not about team. They tend to be about I. Really, really bad examples of that could be full-blown autocracy, or even like out in the world of history, megalomania. So people who are instinctively or always run by their gut and can't really explain why they think a certain way, I over time, I would challenge them in terms of their actual ability to lead.
Yeah. So what you're saying is philosophically it's a yes and. It's not an either or. We all have access to both sides of this. And what I find is that people are over-indexing to one or the other. And what I'm saying, when you're at your best and you are knocking it out of the park and you're having a really powerful, effective day, you're making smart choices, you're making good decisions, sound judgment, you're creating collaborative conversations, you're actually activating both sides of yourself. You're not only tapping into that intellectual framework, but you're also inviting how you're feeling, how you're sensing, how you're picking up things in a situation or an experience. But by the same token, we are also much more in control of our impulses when we've got a balance. We know when to pause. We know when we say, wait, hold on a second. I want to sit with this for a little bit. We know when to be very decisive. We've just got more access to things. And I think about all of the examples that you've provided. I mean, you didn't use the word in the framing intuition and gut, but what you were doing is you were sensing and assessing. You're putting it into an intellectual framework that allows for you to understand what are those patterns of behavior that allow for you to be successful. And when I'm going off course, what's going on? So
that's right on. And I would actually say that one of the elements of good leadership or even great leadership is sort of repeatability, consistency. So again, if you're always going from your gut, that means that you're using sort of your unseen tool, decision-making tool that sits inside your mind, your body, however you want to look at it. And then you have this sort of variable stimulus.
Yeah.
But if you can regularly be present and regularly show that you make the right decision and regularly show, like you say, whether that's that pregnant pause or the opportunity for someone to speak who's not speaking or whatever, however you're sort of leading and conducting at the moment, and do that on a consistent basis, I think people will see you as not just a good leader, but an exceptional leader. I think repeatability and consistency are critical elements of trust. And I think trust is probably one of the cornerstones to great leadership.
So let's talk about you. The trust is a perfect segue to the question that I'd love to ask. And I ask this to everybody that comes on here because I want to talk about Dave the person. So when you think about yourself, and my philosophy is, we're all in service to each other, trying to create this movement of doers and thinkers that are elevating and activating the greatest part of themselves. But I recognize there are crucial people in our communities that keep us accountable to that belief system. Who are those people that are keeping you accountable to your growth and evolution?
Personally, my spouse. I have the good fortune of having a pretty big fan in my spouse, and I think she gets me, and I think she understands certainly the aspirations I have for myself, and so I think she's a huge accountability partner. I have a coach. I've actually, like I said, Ed and Dick were coaches. I've had a couple other coaches. I have a coach now who is very hands off, but man, he is all hands on if I need it. Almost like, oh, I really wish I hadn't made this phone call. But that's okay, because I want that kind of unfiltered feedback and I want that recalibration. I think that's incredibly important, I think, to growth, is that you're always open to growing. My brother, I have two brothers, but one of them also kind of gets me, and he and I talk regularly about challenges I'm having. I obviously have to be a little careful sometimes depending on the context of the challenge, but because it might be, private or public company information, but he's been super useful. I have several select friends that I use as accountability partners, and I actually belong to a men's group. And so after all of the things I've just said about accountability that tend to be more professional accountability. Now, my spouse obviously is accountable. She holds me accountable a lot of stuff, but spiritually, like, who am I? How am I growing? I've had the really good fortune for the last almost 4 years of being in a small men's group of 5 men that came out of a retreat that I went on, like I said, about 5 years ago. And those guys I talk to or meet with every other week, and there's no judgment, which is a big part, I think, of being able to speak truthfully and honestly to others about what's on your mind and the challenges that you're having. That's not even a rule. That is a rule based on some of the guidelines of the group that I belong to, but that's just something that we practice in principle. There's no judgment. And so you feel free to talk about the things that, really think you're holding or bothering you or holding you back or whatever. So I'm really lucky to have a number of people that I go to.
I would love for you to share, obviously a big part of this is none of us are perfect beings. We're all, again, growing, evolving, and working with the contours of our life. What are you working on in yourself?
How many people are going to hear this?
A couple of thousand.
I'm always working on being more present. Always, always, always. I've been a meditation practitioner for at least 3, maybe 4 years now. Very committed to the practice. I'm very committed to being better at expressing my gratitude and appreciating all the different dimensions of my life that continue to bring me great fortune. I do some little things too that just kind of keep my mind right and keep my back straight, as it were. Kind of like the general who talks about making your bed every day. Sometimes somebody might be in that bed when I get up because I get up very early in the morning, so I can't do that. But I always make coffee for myself and my spouse every morning. That's always set up, and I always, do something in the kitchen, usually something around the dishwasher, because I want to set my life in motion with intention. And little things like that are just, incredibly gratifying in some ways, right? Because I know, for instance, what I'm doing benefits somebody else. And I know that for myself, it creates almost kind of a mental health clean sheet. Like the coffee's always going to be ready. The dishwasher's always going to be empty. The glasses or plates or whatever are always going to be where they need to be. And that kind of helps set me up in a orderly way, as it were. So, I guess since you put it in the context of working on, I'm always working to lower the sense of chaos in my life. And I don't have that much. I'm blessed compared to compared to literally like several billion other people in the world. I don't have that much complexity or chaos, but I do work very diligently every day to try to get my arms around that, and kind of own it.
You made me reflect on the coffee and bed making very differently. Thank you for that. I have to have a chat with my husband. So here's my final question for you, Dave. My whole belief is that, we all have some real natural skill and magic within. And when I think about warrior, it's about being a brave and experienced soldier that exhibits things like courage and optimism inside and outside of the office. What is your warrior magic?
Well, I think professionally that it's got to be team first. There's nobody survives alone. And I think generosity of spirit. We can all teach one another something, and we can all be taught. So if we're on a journey where we're learning, you almost have an obligation, if you know something, to share it with others. And certainly because we're on a journey where we're learning, you should be open to inquiry. You should be open to input. What we really want is for each other to manifest our best selves.
Oh, what a great way to end this conversation, for each one of us to manifest our best selves. So Dave, I'm so appreciative that you took the time to be in this conversation with me, and that you shared so much about your leadership philosophies, your experience in the world. And there's just so much wisdom in this conversation. So I'm really appreciative of you taking the time to be with me. Thanks to everybody for listening to another episode of Warriors at Work and letting us be a part of your warrior journey. You can ask questions and make suggestions for future topics at jc@jeanniecoomber.com. Connect with me personally on LinkedIn and Instagram, and join us on the Warrior Conversations channel on YouTube and at the Warrior Magic Community page on Facebook. You can find links to all these places on my website, jeanniecoomber.com. And most importantly, be sure to tell friends about us, subscribe, rate, and review us on iTunes, Spreaker, and Spotify. It helps others find the show and puts more warrior magic out into the world.